Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and I want to talk a little bit about this what if scenario that I've had kicking around inside my head for a bit now. And it's basically a crossover between two classic 80s movies, namely James Cameron's The Terminator from 1984 and Clive Barker's Hellraiser from 1987. So before I get into it, here are just a couple of things. I am going to be mentioning some spoilers from both The Terminator and Hellraiser. So if you haven't seen either of those movies, I'd recommend either checking those movies out before watching this video, or at the very least watching a recap for those movies, or maybe reading or listening to a Cliff Notes version that talks about what happens in those movies. But otherwise, if you have seen those movies, then the scenario I'm about to come up with might make some sense as far as the lore for both movies are concerned, or is concerned. But the other thing is, all this kind of came about because I was thinking about, say, much like a lot of geeks, a lot of nerds do. I mean, sometimes I'll think about, well, okay, what would happen if a character from this movie or that book or that comic book wound up in the universe of such and such, right? So, the case in point, I was wondering, what would happen if one of my personal favorite fictional characters, Kyle Reese from The Terminator, as played by Michael Biehn, ended up in the town of Silent Hill. And so going from there, I was thinking, well, okay, I mean, The Terminator itself is more or less a horror movie with sci-fi trappings, right? But this being the 80s, I mean, well, okay. I mean, we can come back to Silent Hill, but there's all sorts of territory we can explore for a crossover. I mean, we could do Fright Night, and or what if Kyle Reese, somehow or another ended up in, the setting of Fright Night, or I mean, take your pick, right? I mean, hell, we could even do, say, Friday the 13th, or Nightmare on Elm Street, crossover, if we're going in that direction. But then I'm thinking, well, it would have been interesting to see, Kyle Reese, meet Kirsty Cotton, as played by Ashley Lawrence from the first Hellraiser movie. And so I'm thinking, like, okay, well, yeah, that would be pretty neat to see. So how can we make this happen in a way which would make sense to, the lore of, both movies? And so I think I may have come up with something, but this is all just kind of fun and games. I mean, so I'm just kind of, throwing out an idea as far as, a possible crossover between, the first Terminator and the first Hellraiser movie. So basically, if you like the idea, just let me know. But if y'all have some thoughts on it, I'd love to hear them. But let's go ahead and get into this whole crossover. But the whole idea, I think, would start off with 2029, where humanity has just defeated Skynet. And at this point, they discover the time displacement chamber that Skynet had used to send the Terminator back in time to the year 1984 to kill Sarah Connor, before John Connor, the leader of the human resistance, was ever born. And as Dr. Silverman from the first Terminator movie had said, so basically, retroactive abortion. But in the meantime, though, the human resistance goes ahead and sets things up to where they can send one of their own back in time to 1984 to try and protect Sarah Connor from this Terminator. And John Connor, of course, I mean, knows that it's going to be Kyle Reese. I mean, because he knows, from his mother that Kyle Reese was his father, and Kyle Reese has to be the one to go back in time to protect Sarah Connor. Basically, because if she dies, then John Connor doesn't exist. But there's also this whole time loop thing that they got to try and follow, right? So in my mind, the Resistance, they're able to reactivate the time displacement chamber and reprogram it to where they can send Kyle Reese down the line. And they succeed in sending him back in time, but something goes wrong. And the way I'm thinking it is, it kind of goes back to Skynet's sending the Terminator, back in time to 1984, being a Hail Mary play. You kind of factor in the idea of a certain amount of resources were put into making this happen. I mean, like, it could be machinery, it could be temporal energy, and so basically, I'm thinking Skynet had a limited amount of resources for this purpose. It wasn't just an all you can eat buffet equivalent of time travel, right? It was one and done. That's it. And so when the human resistance reactivated the time machine, or the time displacement chamber, while they were able to send Kyle Reese back in time, maybe there wasn't enough in the way of, say, resources or temporal energy or what have you, to send Kyle Reese, to the exact same year that the Terminator was sent to. So instead of sending Kyle Reese to 1984, they send him to 1987. And not only is it the wrong year, but he's in the wrong part of the world, namely the UK. And one of the thing I will say is that I understand that in the first Hellraiser movie, they try and make it look like it's in America with some of the dubbing, but you look at the scenery and everything, and you could definitely tell it's in the UK, right? So we're gonna go with that. The first Hellraiser movie takes place in the UK. So Kyle Reese is sent to 1987 in the UK by mistake, right? And so, I mean, this is basically a fish out of the water situation for him. I mean, much like it was in the first movie, as it originally happened, right? So he's wandering around confused and doesn't know where he is, and somehow or another is able to steal some clothes, and much like he did, as the first movie originally happened, right? And at some point, he's able to learn that he's in the UK, and it's 1987. So this isn't the right year, wrong place. This is the wrong year, wrong place altogether. So, and I imagine that he would try and find a way to look up information about the year 1984, or see if he could find information regarding specific people, because I imagine that he's going to want to find out, okay, is Sarah Connor still alive, or has she been killed by the Terminator? And so I imagine that, I mean, as shabby as he looks, I mean, maybe, he's able to persuade someone to point him in the direction of a library or something like that. I mean, I've never been to the UK, so I don't know how they do libraries there, but, or how they did libraries in the 80s, right? So, I mean, I imagine, Kyle Reese, being directed to a library, and, I mean, yeah, he looks shabby, but, he's minding his own business, and, people don't bother him, he doesn't bother them, but, some of the staff there, I mean, they're kind enough to, show him how to, work microfiche, or, basically look up information about certain time periods and what have you. And so doing some, improvised detective work, Kyle Reese comes to learn that, Sarah Connor was in fact killed in 1984. And not only that, but her murderer was never apprehended, but there was a citywide manhunt for him because this killer was heavily armed and he left quite a trail of bodies behind in the process of killing Sarah Connor. But even though the police looked high and low for him, anytime they came across him, there was a massive shootout. I mean, he would walk away, and so eventually he just disappeared. But unfortunately, amongst those killed, Sarah Connor was one of them. Was one of this mysterious killer's victims. And so at this point, Kyle Reese would put two and two together that this mysterious killer was in fact the Terminator that was sent down the line to kill her. And so, finding out that, Sarah Connor is in fact dead, he's, met with this overwhelming sense of despair and failure because, this, mission is a bust because, without Sarah Connor, there's no John Connor. Without John Connor, there's no human resistance. And so, even though it hasn't happened yet, Kyle Reese, knows that it's too late, or as far as he knows, because, he's not a scientist or a leader, as far as, the upper echelon of things go. He's just, a soldier. You give him a job to do, he does it. So, as far as time travel and everything, his knowledge is very rudimentary. So, as far as he knows, he can't change things. It's already happened, but he does know that at some point in the 90s, Skynet's created, and as a result, humanity is, ends up being at war with the machines. And so, at this point, this is 1987, and here he is in, a whole other part of the world, and he can't really do anything about it because it's already too late. And so I imagine that he'd be, wandering around a bit and, basically, just kind of, without a purpose and what have you, and depressed as well. But at some point, he finds himself in a back alley behind a pet shop, which is where Kirsty Cotton is working. And, somehow or another, I imagine, the two of them meeting, and like maybe she's taking out the trash and going out the back, and well, lo and behold, there's Kyle Reese, sitting in a corner in the alley, and basically bummed out. And so maybe she feels sorry for him, offers him something to eat, and so this sort of, helps him to sort of, come back to reality, so to speak, and basically, open up and, connect with another human being. And, Steve, Kirsty's, boyfriend from the housewarming party that, her family was having, after having, moved back to the UK, Steve, of course, is a little defensive, of Kirsty because, that's his girlfriend, and, this, shifty looking, homeless dude, it's like he doesn't know, what the guy's story is, but, he's kind of on his guard around Kyle and protective of Kirsty. But eventually, though, I imagine, like, the two of them, would both come to, in some way or another, befriend Kyle, and, Kyle would likewise see the two of them as friends. And, maybe, like they offer to, try and point him in the direction of, say, a homeless shelter or something like that. But, this is Kyle Reese. He's, more comfortable in, say, dirty environments. Because, the future he came from was, a dirty environment up to 11. And so, he lives on the streets, but, he lives in such a way to where, he's near the pet shop, and, kind of comes to, see himself as a protector of the place, and, maybe at one point or another, maybe he foils, a robbery after the place is closed, and maybe someone tries to break in, steal stuff, and there he is, protecting the store, and, drives the guys away. So, you got some, little adventures like that, right? And so Kyle Reese is starting to, feel some sense of purpose again. I mean, he can't protect Sarah Connor because she's already dead, but at the very least, I mean, he can, try and, protect, the store, and, the girl that went out of her way to, try and help him, as well as her boyfriend. And so he kind of falls back to his training and everything, and, his soldier mentality. I mean, he has a mission, and it's been changed, and so, but then one day he meets a fellow vagrant, and this would, of course, be the puzzle box guardian, and of course, I mean, this being like a demon in a disguise, I mean, it has, a perception of things to where it's able to, see, I guess you could say, things from outside of, quote unquote, our reality, so to speak, since it's, a part of a whole other realm altogether. But, or it can go back and forth between realms. But I imagine that in this particular meeting, I mean, I don't know, maybe Kyle Reese is, asleep, and, wakes up one morning to find the vagrant, sort of hovering over him, watching him. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe someone's trying to accost the puzzle guardian, and Kyle, not knowing any better, goes out of his way to, protect the guy or something like that. But regardless, the two of them end up meeting. The vagrant, looks at Kyle Reese, and, tells him, that he doesn't belong there. And Kyle is all like, tell me something I don't know, right? But the vagrant, though, just sort of looks at him, but then, getting the feeling that, this guy who's not even supposed to be here, nonetheless, now has a part to play in this unfolding story. And this unfolding story, of course, would be, Frank and Julia's shenanigans. And so, so then we kind of go into, the continuity of, the first Hellraiser movie. And of course, I mean, Frank has been, Uncle Frank has been resurrected, and has escaped from, the realm of the Cenobites, and is in the attic of, his brother's new home, their former childhood home. And, he's in the attic in his, skeletal gelatinous state and everything, and he's convinced Julia to help him, restore himself by luring, men, to the house while Larry's at work, and, and Julia and Frank, kill these guys so Frank can feed on them and basically replenish himself. And he's already told Julia about what happened to him, and he's told her about the Cenobites and what have you. So, this unfolding story gets even more interesting when, Kirsty, she, has a dinner date with her father, with Larry, and Larry confides in her that, he thinks that there's something wrong with Julia, and he's telling, Kirsty that, at first, Julia couldn't stand to be in the place, but now it's like she doesn't even want to leave, and so, and he doesn't quite want to. He doesn't want to say it out loud, because that would be admitting that he suspects her of having an affair. But he is thinking on some level that she, might be, cheating on him, but he's hoping that maybe, she's, just, kind of depressed from, um, you know, from issues regarding their marriage, because, Larry, of course, doesn't know that, Julia cheated on him with his brother Frank. We're talking like, you know, either, right before the wedding or during the wedding, right? But but of course, Larry doesn't know all that, but he knows that something's up with Julia. But on the other hand, though, I mean, he's thinking, okay, well, maybe Julia's lonely, and she doesn't have any friends, and so maybe she could just use someone to talk to, and so like maybe another girl, so to speak, and so he asks Kirsty, as he does in the you know original story, to check on Julia. Just maybe go by the house and you know and talk to her stepmom, and maybe see if the two of them can become friends or something like that, because maybe Julia just you know needs someone to open up to. I mean, a fellow lady. And so Kirsty was kind of like, okay, I'll do it. I mean, she doesn't like Julia, but she, loves her father, and, she doesn't, want him to, worry about, Julia. And, on one hand, I mean, she's kind of wanting to, you know, help keep, the peace, between, Larry and Julia. But on the other hand, though, if Julia is in fact cheating, on Larry, then, she wants to basically catch her in the act. But she also understands that, her father's not wanting to, give voice to this. So she agrees to, go see Julia, one day, and, basically, try and, see if she can figure out, what's up with her. But before she does that, though, um, she has a shift at work, and on one of her breaks, she goes outside and to the alley, and she sees the vagrant watching her from the shadows. But then she comes across Kyle, and she's asking Kyle if he knows that guy, because he's come in the store a couple of times and caused a scene by eating crickets and other things. And Kyle just tells her he doesn't know who the guy is, but the guy seems to be a little crazy, but kind of keeps to himself. But he sort of keeps his eye on him, and the vagrants watching the two of them as they talk. But and so they sort of step away to where they can talk in private. And at this point, of course, Kirsty and Kyle have become friends and are able to talk about things. And Kyle's not quite ready to tell her his story. Like, he's not quite able to tell her, hey, I came from the future, and yeah, it's really messed up there, and I was supposed to protect someone, but something went wrong, and yeah, humanity's kind of screwed now, but we still have some time, right? Um, so he can't bring himself to go into full detail about what his real story is, but he's been able to sort of give her a white lie version of his background and everything. So he's able to tell. He tells her that he's told her that he's a soldier, and things didn't go well for him, but nonetheless, though, they've been able to open up about their lives and everything, and become kind of close. Much to Steve's jealousy. Or I should say, Steve's noticed this from time to time and is kind of jealous. But Kyle, of course, he's got more of a soldier mindset than a player mindset. So while he does care about Kirsty and definitely finds her attractive, he's not trying to hit it, so to speak. Like he, basically respects the fact that, Kirsty and, Steve are an item, right? So it, at this point, Kirsty and, Kyle are talking with one another, and she, lets him in on the conversation that she and her father had at on the dinner date about Julia. And she's talked to Kyle about her stepmom before, and basically about how the neither of them like each other. There's like this cordial but cool relationship going on between them. But she does tell Kyle that she is concerned that Julia might be manipulating Larry and lying to him, but she's hoping that maybe she's just depressed for some reason and just needs someone to talk to, like her father is thinking. And but at the same time, she definitely has her doubts. But she tells him she tells him though that she's also had some terrifying nightmares as of late. I mean, like scary enough to where she wakes up screaming, and whenever Steve's staying over at her apartment, is woken up as well and having to calm her down, and because she's terrified and in a cold sweat and everything. And in these nightmares, I mean, she sees this horrifying imagery of her father, um, basically skinless except for his face, and she hears birds flying around somewhere, and a baby crying, and there's blood everywhere. And so she's worried about her father because of has these dreams, or she's had these dreams more than once, ever since she moved to the UK with her father and stepmom. But as she's talking about this, Kyle sort of has a flashback of his own, because he's had several waking nightmares, because of his traumatic experiences in the future, where he comes from. So I mean, he can sympathize with her being troubled by bad dreams. But when she tells him when she's going to go see Julia, Kyle makes a point to remember the date and when she's going to be going over there. And so when that day comes, Kirsty, heads on over to her dad and stepmom's place to, go, check on Julia, right? But in the meantime, though, she's secretly being tailed by Kyle, and he was able to basically sneak around and follow her, and basically before he set out to follow her, um, he when Steve came by the store to see Kirsty, shortly before this, she told Steve about what she was going to be doing that day. And after Kirsty left, Kyle talks to Steve and says, hey, you might want to keep an eye on her, just look out for her. And Steve's like, what are you talking about, what's going on? And Kyle just says, look, just look out for her, okay? And because he's got a strange feeling that something's going to happen, and Steve's like, okay, yeah. I mean, he's come to sort of like Kyle on a sort of guarded level, right? But at the same time, I mean, he does see him as this sort of maybe traumatized homeless dude, but at the same time, I mean, he's not quite ready to entirely brush off Kyle's warning. So he does say that, okay, when Kirsty gets back, I'll make sure she's okay and everything. But so Kirsty goes to her parents' house, and Kyle follows her. And it's a good thing too, because at this point, when Kirsty goes into the house, or she's basically just seen her stepmom bring a strange man into the home, and she's thinking that this is the guy that Julia's been seeing. She is having an affair, behind Larry's back, and so she follows them into the house, at a discreet distance, and is trying to see if she can catch them in the act. But instead, she walks in on the guy being horrifically murdered by both Julia and Frank, and the guy basically pleads for help, and and he's desiccated and falling apart and everything because of Frank having fed on him. And when Frank basically makes it known to her that, hey, it's Uncle Frank, and there's this skinless monster wanting to you know have his way with his niece. I mean, she just freaks out, and which is around the point when Kyle uh, makes his way into the house, and he hears the screaming, and he follows the noise upstairs, and at that point he sees the dead body, and he's like, what the f is going on here? And I should mention that Kyle has been able to um, put together some makeshift weaponry, like maybe some sort of improvised hammer or something sharp. And so he wasn't able to get a hold of a gun because, I mean, this is the UK. Guns apparently aren't readily available like they are in America. So he can't just go into a police car and swipe a shotgun and saw it off. I mean, it's like he's having to get some basic materials here. But he sees the body, and he follows the screaming from the room in the attic, and he storms into there, makeshift weaponry in hand, and he sees this skinless monster molesting Kirsty, and she's desperately trying to fight him off, and Kyle goes into attack, and basically is able to drive Frank off, and he's able to hit him with his hammer and with his knife, and or the carving knife that he picked up, and do some damage to Frank. But while Frank is certainly in agony, it doesn't kill him, and he charges at Kyle. And at that point, Kyle's trying to keep Kirsty safe, and he's trying to drive her to the door while he guards her back. And at that point, Julia comes out of hiding with a knife, trying to kill both Kirsty and Kyle. And so it's chaos all around. And at that point, while Kirsty's struggling with Julia, Kyle is sort of caught between Frank, trying to fend off Frank and trying to protect Kirsty. And so he basically takes a risk and doubles back on Frank after having knocked him aside with his hammer, which I should mention is probably like something small, something that he can conceal, but nonetheless packs a punch, like something he can hide in his trench coat. But he's able to for a moment drive Frank off with the hammer, and then he goes to where Julia and Kirsty are fighting, and he's able to knock the knife out of Julia's hand, breaking it with his hammer. And when she starts freaking out and crying and trying to charge him at the same time, Frank comes charging back at Kyle once more. And so Kyle kind of instinctively grabs Julia and throws her at Frank. And Frank, I mean, him being grievously injured by Kyle, courtesy of the carving knife and the hammer, basically grabs Julia, and Julia's initially thinking that Frank's trying to comfort her, and sort of holds her in this you know embrace, but then he feeds on her and uses her up so that way he can heal, and much like he says in the original movie, nothing personal, baby, right? And so further restored, he turns his attentions to Kyle, but at this point Kyle's was able to grab Kirsty and get her down the stairs, and so Frank charges them, and this time though Kirsty and Kyle are able to work together to kill Frank, and Kirsty was actually able to grab this strange puzzle box that she literally tripped over in the attic when she was trying to get away from Frank, and used that as a weapon to bludgeon him on the skull, and Kyle was able to basically stab him and mortally wound him, and after the two of them kill him, I mean Kyle applying the finishing stroke with his hammer, I mean at this point, I mean Frank has just been taken apart, and he's scattered gruesomely all over the place, but and of course Julia's dead, and so Kirsty, I mean she's freaking out, and Kyle, I mean he's still on an adrenaline high, but he's making sure she's okay. I mean she's traumatized and she's got blood on her, but none of it's hers. It's all from the poor guy who Julia lured to the place, and also from Frank, and so once he's able to help Kirsty calm down, Kirsty first calls the police, and then gets in touch with her father and tells Larry that something horrible has happened at the house, and she doesn't even know where to begin, and so the police get there and they're just baffled at everything, at the whole scene. I mean because in searching the house, they find the corpses of the other victims of Frank and Julia, and when they see the state of Julia and Frank's bodies, I mean Julia being a shriveled corpse, and Frank basically being taken apart, the two of them are thinking that Kyle, I mean sorry, the police are thinking that Kyle and Kirsty are the killers, and and Frank and Julia are innocent victims. And so by the time Larry gets to the house, I mean he's trying to get to his daughter and everything, and also Steve arrives as well, and and of course him being a friend of Larry's, I mean he's wanting to know what the heck happened, and Larry's like, I don't know. I mean I got this frantic call from Kirsty, and now the police are there, and they're taking her and this homeless guy to a jail, and I don't know what's going on. And so watching from a distance, the Vagrant is taking all this in, and he notes how Kirsty had the puzzle box on her, but when the police took her and Kyle to jail to question them, she dropped the box, and so the Vagrant, the puzzle guardian, picks it up and ponders what happens next, because this was a twist to things that he didn't expect, or it didn't expect. And so from there Kyle and Kirsty are interrogated, by the police. And of course, Kyle, I mean, much like he told Kirsty, you know, basically claims that he was a soldier who, came to grief and, fell on hard times and, came to befriend Kirsty and basically, followed her on a hunch and, ended up saving her life. And Kirsty, of course, tells the police, about her, and her father's, suspicions about Julia having an affair and not realizing that something, even more sinister was going on. And so from there, um, Larry and Steve, come to um, visit Kirsty, who is still in jail, but she can have visitors. And, she doesn't know, when she's going to get out. And, Larry readily offers to, have call a lawyer to, come, defend her. And so Kirsty's like, I mean, she doesn't really know what else to say, but yeah, I mean, I think that's the only thing we can do right now because I don't know what's going on. And as for Kyle, though, I mean, he has no documentation on him. I mean, nothing showing his identity or where he might have come from or anything like that. So he's kind of a blank slate. So unfortunately, he doesn't have the luxury of you know a family member that's willing to spring for a lawyer, and so unfortunately, um, he's most likely going to be stuck in jail for a while. But Kirsty, nonetheless, gets a message through to him that she'll uh, try and see if the lawyer can help get him out as well. But in the meantime, though, the police bring another prisoner in, and this prisoner, ends up in, you know, the same area of the jail where Kyle is being held. Not in the same cell, mind you, but in one of the nearby cells. And when Kyle sees this, he recognizes the guy. It's that vagrant who told him that he didn't belong there. And so from there, the vagrant, discreetly pulls out the puzzle box and, puts his hand through the bars holding the puzzle box and shows it to Kyle. And mind you, they're across away from each other. And then the vagrant drops the box and the box rolls over to Kyle. And Kyle picks the box up, not knowing what it is, but regarding the vagrant with a sense of bewilderment and unease. But the vagrant doesn't say anything, just watches to see what Kyle will do. So, okay, yeah, that was, this is the first time I've actually, you know, verbalized, this whole idea about, this crossover between the Terminator and Hellraiser. And I mean, I've told a couple of friends about the idea, but it was kind of in the rough stages and only a few bits and pieces here and there. But this is the first time I've actually put this idea out and for people to hear and all the detail and everything. So yeah, if you made it this far, I hope you found it of interest. And if you're a Terminator or Hellraiser fan, I hope you like the idea of this crossover and how it happened, or how it could happen, I guess, because I mean there's so many other ways that the story could go. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it, or at the very least found it a pleasant diversion. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you got any questions, comments, or if you have any sort of suggestions as to how the story could continue, or how this idea could have, another way this, crossover could have happened, like another turn of events of Kyle and Kirsty meeting. And of course, in this particular turn of events, while I involved the puzzle box guardian, aka the vagrant, I left out the Cenobites. And so, obviously they're a part of things, but not this particular story. They don't make an appearance here, but that doesn't mean that they can't later on. So, yeah, if you got any ideas as to, how that story could go, let me know. Or just any suggestions for the story as is, well, let me know. I'd love to hear from y'all. So, I hope y'all enjoyed it, and y'all have a good night. Take care. Bye.